Dear course participants, I welcome you all to this lecture on grant proposal writing. Grant proposal writing is a very interesting topic but often less well understood or less well taught. It is just the process of writing your project proposal to a funding agency in order to get the money you require to get your project on road. So, let's look at the learning objectives for this session. There are three learning objectives for this session. One is you have to describe the basic tenets of the grant writing process. Two, you have to describe the features of a good grant proposal. Three, you have to delineate the factors which increase the chances of getting funded. We will go through this session in 5 broad outlines. Number 1, why do you need this skill as a researcher? Number 2, what are the steps in responding to a funding call? Number 3, what are the elements of a strong grant proposal? Number 4, what are the different types of funding agencies? Number 5, I am going to give you some additional tips to write a strong grant proposal. So let's look at why there is a need to acquire grant proposal writing skills. A researcher should acquire this skill early in his career. Researchers depend upon grant money to conduct their projects. So it is an essential part of a research career. You will also require skills for convincing the funding agency that your ideas are worthy and exciting. There could be two starting points for a grant proposal. The first starting point could be you have a project in hand and you are actively seeking out funds for that project. The second starting point could be you come across a funding call and you want to write a proposal specific to that funding call. Out of these two, the first one is more common. So what is a funding call? I have been talking about funding call for quite some time, but what is a funding call? A funding call is nothing but when a funding agency asks researchers to submit proposals on a particular topic for a certain amount of money. These funding agencies could be governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations. These calls can be given out periodically or they can be given out ad hocly. For example, in the recent COVID-19 pandemic, you must have seen many funding agencies were giving out funding calls on specific topics for the research in COVID-19. These funding calls may be known by other names like request for proposal, call for funding, etc. They all mean the same, so please bear that in mind. How do you respond to a funding call? How do you go about? Generally speaking, researchers have a generic proposal in hand and they are actively trying to look out for funding calls. Once they get a funding call, they will try to modify their generic proposal according to the needs of the funding call. These funding calls may reach you through your colleagues or institutions, or you can also check the websites of these funding agencies regularly so that you can keep yourselves informed of the latest funding calls. Once you get in touch with a funding call, the first thing that you need to do is read the guidelines of the funding call thoroughly. Now let's move on to the next session, which is steps in responding to a funding call. So what are the different steps that you must go through in responding to a funding call? So this flow chart shows you how you progress through the different steps. First, you have to decide the type of project that you are going to submit. Secondly, you have to find the different funding agencies which will be suitable for your project. Tailor the proposal which you have in hand to the specific call. So as I said before, researchers generally have a standard proposal in which the different parts of the methodology are written out, and then they try to modify this generic proposal to the requirements of the funding agency. Then we submit a letter of inquiry or a full proposal. Sometimes some funding agencies ask you to submit a letter of inquiry. Once they think that your idea is worth, they will ask you to submit a full proposal. Sometimes funding agencies straight away ask you to submit a full proposal. After this step, the funding agency reviews your proposal and then gives a decision. You can either accept or decline this decision. If you accept the fund, you have to complete certain formalities and then carry out the project. At the end of the project, you have to submit the final report. So let's see these steps one by one. The type of project that you are going to submit is important. Is your research a pilot project or a full-blown research agenda? Is it a postgraduate thesis or a postdoctoral research? Is it a fellowship at an institution that will support your work, or is it a multi-year clinical project with multiple staff members? So try to fit your research project into one of these categories and try to find the funding agency appropriate for that type of project. You can refine your research topic by asking yourself these questions. Why is this topic important? What is the relevance of my topic? What are the different hypotheses that I am trying to prove or disprove here? What are my research methods? Am I going to use qualitative methods or quantitative methods or both? Am I going to do an observational study or am I going to do an intervention study? These questions will help you refine your research topic. The next step is to find funding agencies suitable to your research topic. Now I know this is a time-consuming task, but it has the potential for great benefits later on. Now try to prepare a list of all the possible funding agencies which are suitable to your research topic. You can ask your colleagues, you can go through websites, you can perform a Google search, you can talk to reviewers who will be able to find out the funding agencies which are specific to your needs. Match the proposal to the priorities of the funding agency. Now how do I find out this? If you go to the website of the funding agency, you will find an about page where they would have listed their priorities. So make sure that you go to the about page of the funding agency and try to read through their priorities. If your proposal matches the priorities of the funding agency, you have a high chance of getting funded. Please remember, even the most appealing proposal in the world is unlikely to succeed if not sent to the right agency. So make sure that your proposal fits the priorities of the funding agencies. Now, what are these funding agencies and how do I know about them? There are many sources of information like databases of funding agencies. We will look at them in detail in the later sections, but for the time being, you can remember that there are several types of agencies like government institutions, Icmr, DST, DBT. There are many universities which have offices of research which will provide you information about funding agencies and they will also help you to write your grant proposal. This is more common in the Western countries. Then there are reputable private organizations and non-governmental organizations which also serve as funding agencies. Once you have decided your funding agency, you have to tailor your generic proposal to the finer requirements of the funding agency. When writing, assume that your proposal is going to be read by intellectual academic professionals. So you have to talk in scientific terms and use the right terminology so that the reviewers know that you are serious about your project. Some of the questions that the reviewers ask themselves while reviewing your proposal are: what is the novelty here? Is this project bringing something new? Is the finding of this project going to be worth knowing? And finally, they might ask themselves, how will we know that the conclusions of this particular project are going to be valid, which is essentially your methodology. So please remember, the reviewers will look at these three things when going through your proposal. What are the next steps? So once you have your proposal ready as per the guidelines of the funding agency, get it reviewed by your peers, colleagues, mentors, or even reviewers. Once it is done, they will give you constructive feedback and valuable inputs to increase the strength of your proposal. Following this, you can submit the proposal to the funding agency as per the guidelines given out in the funding call, and then you have to wait for the decision. Once the decision is out, you can either accept or reject that decision from your side. If you accept the decision, administrative procedures follow. These usually involve filling up forms, furnishing bank details, etc. etc. After you have done the administrative formalities, you carry on with your project, complete the project, and provide progress reports, and at the end of the project, you have to submit your final project report to the funding agency as per their requirements. So briefly, these are the different steps that are involved in writing a grant proposal, carrying out a project, and submitting the final report. Now, let us look at the elements of a strong proposal. Now, as I promised previously, I am going to walk you through the different elements of a strong proposal. What makes a strong proposal? A strong proposal is a proposal which has a high chance of getting accepted and funded. So, most researchers seek funding from several different funding agencies. So, they have a proposal ready in a general template. Once a funding call is received, they modify this general template to suit the requirements of the funding agency. Your general proposal should explain your project to an academic audience. So make sure that you are using scientific terminology and the proper words that communicate your project proposal. So these are the different sections in which you can organize your proposal. Some of the standard sections are cover letter, title page, abstract, introduction, literature review, project description, budget and justification, timeline, and references. And in the previous lectures, you might have seen most of these sections, but the section which is specific to a grant proposal is budget and justification. And so we will discuss budget and justification in detail in the next few slides. So when preparing the budget, make sure you read the agency's guidelines and agency's requirements for preparing the budget. Tabulate in a spreadsheet under different heads and categories. We will look at the heads and categories in the subsequent slides. Add unit cost and the number of units and the years of the project. So unit cost is the cost per item, and the number of units is the number of units of that particular item that you require, and for how many years do you require that item. Add justification for each item and follow the rules of purchase and recruitment. The agency will have certain rules to be followed for recruiting personnel and for buying equipment. Your institution will also have rules for recruiting personnel and for buying equipment. So make sure that you stay within those rules, and please avoid math errors in the calculation. These are the different categories under which we can budget a particular item. So broadly speaking, there are three categories, that is recurring cost, non-recurring cost, and other costs. Under recurring cost, you have to include staff or personnel and consumables. Under non-recurring cost, you have to include equipment, and in the other cost, you can include travel and overhead charges. Now there is a different type of budgeting that some funding agencies require, which is called task-based budgeting. So instead of putting the items in the budget, you put tasks in the budget. For example, the task may be conducting a field survey, the task may be developing information, education, communication materials, something like that. So make sure that your budget meets the agency's requirements. This is a general template for a budget plan. So as you can see, the first column contains the heads, the second column contains the item, the third column contains the justification for that particular item, the fourth column contains the unit, the fifth column contains the unit cost, the sixth column contains the quantity, and the final column contains the total cost. Let's look at staff. So you will need staff members for your project, right? So you have to justify in detail why you require that staff member. It might be a laboratory technician, it might be a field worker, it might be a data entry operator, it might be a scientist B, C, or D. So any staff member that you want to recruit in your project should have a proper justification. Be explicit about the skill sets that are required for this particular staff member. So mention the degree which that particular person must have, mention the number of years that that particular person must have, etc. So budget only for the period required. You may not require this particular staff member for the entire project duration. For example, you might need field workers only for the first 3 months or the first 6 months. So budget only for that particular period. Show people who are already on regular pay as zero cost. If your institution has an administrative person who will be assisting you in your project, but he is a regular employee of that institution, you can show that employee and put the cost as zero. This increases your chances of acceptance because it shows that you are willing to commit other resources as well. Consider outsourcing or consultancy. For example, if you are trying to design a website for a project, instead of hiring a web developer, you can outsource this task to a consulting agency, which will bring down the cost of that particular task. And as you must be knowing, staff constitutes a major proportion of the budget, and that is where the most common cut happens. Here, I have shown you an example of a staff budget. So, in this staff budget, there are two members, scientist D and technical assistant. In the next column, I have given the justification for the staff member, the degree the staff member must have, and the number of years of experience that staff member must have. And I have put the monthly salary under unit cost and the number of months that that person is required, and then the final cost. Let's talk about equipment. So, just like staff members, equipments must also be justified in detail. Be explicit about the make and the model of the equipment that you are willing to purchase for this particular project. If you are going to use available equipment in your institution, please show that equipment and show as zero cost. This also shows your willingness to commit existing resources. Don't forget to add maintenance cost. For example, if you are buying an expensive laboratory equipment, that equipment may require periodic maintenance. So try to budget in maintenance cost as well. If you are trying to buy laptops, they might require maintenance as well. So try to budget in the service cost as well. So here I have shown you an example of an equipment budget. Here I have budgeted 3 items: laptop, the statistical software, and a workstation furniture. And you can see the justification provided and the unit cost of each item and the total number of quantities of that particular item required and the total cost for equipment. Here it would be a good idea to mention the make and the model of each equipment that you are requesting. Next, let's talk about consumables or supplies. So these are items like printer, ink, syringes, vacuuminers, paper, gloves, mask, stationery. These are items which are frequently bought for the project. Budget generously, these are most likely to be accepted without any cuts. If you are going to buy supplies which have an expiration date, please make sure to buy these items evenly spaced out over the project period so that they don't get expired before the project is completed. Here I have shown you an example of a consumables budget. Here we have budgeted office essentials like files, folders, binders, highlighters, markers, whiteboard, printer cartridges, etc. Here I have also shown the recruitment cost, which is nothing but the advertisements that have to be sent out to recruit staff members. And I also budgeted meeting costs. Let's talk about other costs. Under other costs, you can include travel costs, consultancy charges, and institutional overheads. Institutional overheads are nothing but a certain amount of money which is given to the institution for providing services to you like space, electricity, telephone, water, vehicle. So these are the privileges or the facilities that you enjoy as being part of that institution. So institutions will require a certain amount of money for them to provide this particular service. Usually this is kept between 2% and 5%. You should read the guidelines of your institution as well as the funding agency to see what the maximum allowed limit of overhead charges are. Here I have shown you an example of travel costs and institutional overhead. Here the institutional overhead is 2%. So that is 2% of your total project cost will be charged as institutional overhead. So here we see a complete budget proposal including all the items and the total cost. Once you have written out the different parts of the proposal, please make sure that the different parts of the proposal are tied to each other nicely. Establish connections between the different parts. So when I am reading your introduction and moving on to literature review, I should instantly make the connection that this literature review is for that particular objective. And when I move on to methodology, I should instantly make the connection that this particular part of the methodology talks about this particular objective. This reduces the burden on the reviewer and gives a good impression about your proposal. This is the most important part of writing a proposal. Each part of the proposal should be connected to each other, and that is what I mean by tying together the different parts of the proposal. Let's talk about funding agencies. As I said previously, funding agencies can be of different types. The two main types are governmental agencies and private agencies. These are the list of some governmental agencies and some private agencies. Let me talk to you about Icmr grants in specific. So Icmr provides extramural grants for people who are not working in Icmr. It also provides other types of funds like funds for postgraduate and super specialty thesis. It provides grants for postdoctoral research. It provides grants for international travel and conducting research workshops. I invite you to visit the Icmr website to know more about these grants. Who can apply for Icmr grants? Regular researchers or scientists who are working in universities, medical colleges, postgraduate institutions, academic institutions, recognized laboratories, and NGOs are eligible for applying for these grants. These grants are intended to supplement facilities in the host institutions. These are examples of some international funding agencies which fund research work in the field of health. If you are applying for international funding agencies, these require to be cleared by the Health Ministry's screening committee. So make sure you apply for the proper approvals. These are some databases where you get information about funding agencies in one place. In India, you can look at the research and development funding schemes of central government, and you can look at the research development office of the National Center for Biological Sciences. So these are databases of different funding agencies. If you visit them, the different funding agencies are listed one by one and their calls are also listed. Other websites which provide such database services are grants.gov, healthresearchfunders.org. Now I am going to provide you some additional tips on how to write a strong grant proposal. The first thing that I would want you to ensure is beware of conflict of interest. Disclose both financial as well as non-financial relationships between yourself and the funding agency. Vet your funding agencies. Make sure that the funding agency to which you are applying is reputable. Be careful of the role of the funder in your project. Ideally speaking, the funder should have no role in determining the course of your project, in determining the findings of your project, and in deciding to publish your findings. At the end of the project, when you have to submit your paper for a journal, you have to put this statement as a disclosure. When you are done with the project and you are planning to write a paper and submit to a journal, you have to specifically state the role of the funder in your project. What are some of the things that increase the chances of success of a grant proposal? Read the call thoroughly and strictly follow the guidelines of the application process. If you have any doubts in the application process, kindly call the funding agency and clarify your queries. Be realistic in designing your project proposal. So, don't undersell yourself as well as don't oversell yourself. It will be a good idea to study successful proposals. If your seniors or mentors or if your colleagues have submitted proposals which have been accepted, it would be a good idea to go through these proposals carefully and try to find out what clicked for them. Establish a collaborative network. It is a good idea to apply to a funding agency as a collaborative network rather than as individuals. If you can set up a collaborative network of professionals from different institutions, you have a higher chance of getting funded. For example, you can involve different departments of your institution or you can involve different institutions. It is also a good idea to involve a multidisciplinary team. So, different people from different backgrounds add value to your proposal and increase the strength of your proposal. So, you can include a basic scientist, you can include a statistician, you can include a social scientist, you can include an economist. It is a good idea to establish a good track record in research and then apply for funding agencies. Funders are more willing to provide money to researchers who have a good track record in research. So, think from the funder's perspective. In terms of developing the proposal itself, the following points increase your chances of success. Start early and leave time for feedback. Get feedback from a variety of experts. Consult a statistician to write the methodology part of your proposal with specific reference to sample size calculation and data analysis plan. Please make explicit connections between the different parts of your proposal so that when the reader reads your proposal, everything falls into place naturally. Other points to remember when you are developing the proposal is to build a solid rationale for your proposal. This should come in the introduction part of your proposal. Try to put across the point that your research proposal is going to fill this particular knowledge gap and this is the novelty that I am bringing to the table. Highlight the impact of your work in terms of societal benefit. Some funding agencies specifically look into this part of the proposal. Is your proposal going to make a social impact? Is it going to be beneficial to vulnerable sections of the population? Is your proposal going to benefit large sections of the society? If you can convince the funding agency that your project proposal is likely to have a societal benefit, it increases the chances of success. Make sure you make the budget appropriate and with strong justification. As I said previously, try to show the funding agency that you are willing to commit resources from your institution in addition to what the funder is going to give you. Make sure that your administrative parts are in order. These are the documents and forms which are required by the funding agency as well as your institution, such as bank details, mandate forms, consent forms, etc. etc. Please remember, developing strong proposals takes time, effort, and experience. So, practice makes perfect, and developing a strong grant proposal is no exception to this rule. I want to leave you with these take-home messages. Grant proposal writing is an important skill. Strong proposals require practice. So, if you get rejected at first, please do not despair. Strong proposals require time and practice, and it is a skill that can be acquired. So, please practice, repeat, review, and revise, and resubmit. If you are a beginner, I would recommend that you start small and establish a good track record of research in that particular area, which increases your credibility as a researcher and increases the chances of acquiring funding in future. I cannot emphasize this point enough Please make sure that the objectives of your proposal align with the priorities of the funding agency. The funding agency's priorities can be found in their About page. Please beware of conflicts of interest between you and the funding agency. I wish you all success in your grant proposal submissions, and thank you for patient listening.